Tonight, we're going back to Chicago in the winter of 1956. Two sisters left their house on a Friday evening to see an Elvis Presley movie. They had seen it 10 times before. They promised their mother they would be home before midnight. They never came back. For 25 days, the city searched for them. Hundreds of police officers, thousands of flyers. Hundreds of thousands of people questioned. Elvis Presley himself went on the radio and asked the girls to come home. And then, on a frozen roadside 15 miles from the theater where they were last seen, a man driving to buy groceries spotted what he thought were two mannequins lying in the snow behind a guardrail, but they were not mannequins. Barbara was 15, Patricia was 12. They were found nude, frozen, and positioned together in a way that suggested they had been placed there deliberately. No one could agree on how they died, no one could agree on when they died, and the investigation that followed would be consumed by false confessions, political infighting, destroyed evidence, and a question that still has no answer. What happened in the hours after those two girls left the Brighton Theater on the night of the 28th of December, 1956? In the first half of this video, we'll go through the full story, the disappearance, the search, the discovery, and the suspects who were never convicted. In the second half, we'll look at the psychology of this case, what the absence of a clear cause of death tells us, what the sightings mean, and why a mother's certainty about her own daughters may have been the most important clue that no one followed. Sit back and listen to the story of the Grimes sisters' murders. Chicago in December of 1956 was a city of nearly 3.5 million people. But within that sprawl, neighborhoods like McKinley Park still felt like small towns. The kind of place where families knew each other through the parish, where children walked to school in groups, and where mothers kept track of each other's kids without being asked. The Grimes family lived at 3634 South Damon Avenue, in a modest home on a quiet residential street. Loretta Grimes was raising 7 children largely on her own. She and her husband Joseph had divorced in 1951 on amicable terms, and the children maintained regular contact with their father. But Loretta was the one who held the household together. She worked to pay the mortgage. She assigned the children chores. She kept the structure intact. Among her children were 2 daughters who, by all accounts, were inseparable. Barbara Jean Grimes was 15. She was a student at Thomas Kelly High School, quiet, responsible, and close with her siblings. Patricia Kathleen Grimes was 12, 3 days short of her 13th birthday. She attended St. Maurice's Catholic School. She was described as lively and devoted to her older sister. The two of them did everything together. They walked to school together. They shared friends. They spent their free time in each other's company. And in the winter of 1956, they shared one other thing, an absolute devotion to Elvis Presley. Both girls had recently joined his official fan club. They collected his photographs. They listened to his music at the record counter of the local department store. And when his first film, Love Me Tender, opened at the Brighton Theater on Archer Avenue, about 1.5 miles from their home, they went to see it. And then they went again and again. By the 28th of December, 1956, Barbara and Patricia Grimes had seen Love Me Tender 10 times. That Friday evening, they decided to see it an 11th. They left their home at approximately 7:30 p.m. with about $2.50 between them, enough for admission, popcorn, and bus fare home. Barbara had been instructed by their mother to keep 50 cents in the zipper of her wallet in case they stayed for the second screening of the double feature. Loretta told them to be home before midnight. It was bitterly cold that night, the kind of deep Chicago winter cold that cuts through coats and makes every block feel longer than it is. The Brighton Theater sat at 4223 South Archer Avenue. It was a neighborhood cinema, the kind of place where teenagers gathered on weekends, where the ushers knew the regulars, and where a girl could feel safe sitting in the dark watching her favorite movie star for the 11th time. Barbara and Patricia arrived, bought their tickets, and found their seats. A school friend of Patricia's named Dorothy Weinert was there that evening with her own younger sister. Weinert later told investigators she had been seated behind the Grimes girls during the film. At around 9:30 p.m., during the intermission between features, Weinert and her sister decided to leave. On her way out, she saw Barbara and Patricia in line to buy popcorn. They were in good spirits, nothing seemed wrong, nothing seemed unusual. Dorothy Weinert was the last person known to have seen Barbara and Patricia Grimes alive inside the theater. The girls stayed for the second screening of Love Me Tender. That screening would have ended at approximately 11:15 p.m., putting them on track to arrive home by 11:45, just as their mother expected. But 11:45 came and went, then midnight. Loretta Grimes had already begun to worry by 11:30. At midnight, she sent her older daughter Teresa, who was 17, and her son Joey, who was 14, to wait at the bus stop at 35th and Hoyne, the stop closest to their home. They stood there in the cold and watched 3 buses come and go. Barbara and Patricia were not on any of them. Teresa and Joey walked home. Loretta had already called every friend she could think of. No one had seen them. No one had heard from them. At 2:15 a.m. on the 29th of December, 1956, Loretta Grimes filed a missing persons report with the Chicago Police Department. Her 2 daughters had walked out the front door 7 hours earlier to see a movie they had already seen 10 times. They had not come home. In the hours and days that followed, a picture began to form of what might have happened after the girls left the Brighton Theater. It was a picture made up entirely of fragments, sightings, half-remembered glimpses, and contradictions that would never be resolved. Several teenagers who had been at the Brighton that night told investigators they had seen Barbara and Patricia outside the theater after the show ended. According to these witnesses, the sisters had been talking with a young man whose appearance was strikingly similar to that of Elvis Presley. They described him as getting into or standing near a car. The vehicle was consistently described as a Mercury model. A young man named Roger Menard told police he had also been at the screening that night and had left the theater about a minute before the sisters. Walking down Archer Avenue, he noticed them a short distance behind him. A late-model green Buick pulled up alongside them. The girls hesitated but kept walking. Then, just past 42nd Street, a black 1949 Mercury occupied by 2 teenage boys pulled alongside them as well. The girls giggled but continued walking in the direction of their home. Then came the sighting that would be repeated in every account of this case for decades afterward. 2 teenage boys named Ed Lorden and Earl Zastro were driving through McKinley Park at approximately 11:30 p.m. on the night of the 28th of December. They told investigators they had seen 2 girls on 35th Street near Sealy and Damon Avenues. The girls had been giggling and jumping out of doorways at each other, playful, apparently at ease. One of the boys recognized them. "Oh yeah," he said to the other, "it's those 2 Grimes sisters." At that point, the girls were approximately 2 blocks from their home. After that, nothing, no confirmed sighting, no phone call, no note, no sound. Whatever happened to Barbara and Patricia Grimes happened somewhere in those final 2 blocks, or shortly after they passed through them. At 2:15 in the morning, their mother filed the report, but what Loretta encountered in those first hours was not the urgent response she expected. Several investigators initially assigned to the case theorized that the sisters had simply run away from home. Others suggested they might be voluntarily staying with boyfriends. Despite Loretta's insistence that her daughters were not the type to disappear without word, despite her certainty that something was terribly wrong, the case was not treated with full seriousness for nearly a week. It would take approximately 7 days of complete silence, no contact with family, no contact with friends, no sign of life from either girl, before the investigation was appropriately escalated to a genuine missing persons case. By the 31st of December, 3 days after their disappearance, Barbara and Patricia Grimes were front-page news across Chicago. But for those first critical days, the assumption held by many in the department was that 2 teenage girls had done what teenage girls sometimes did. That they had gotten swept up in something, that they would come back on their own. Loretta Grimes knew better. She had raised these girls. She knew their habits, their routines, their limits. She knew they would not simply vanish without word. She knew they would not board a train to Nashville or check into a hotel with strangers. But no one in a position of authority was listening, not yet, and with each day that passed, whatever trail might have been followed in those first hours grew colder. At one point, the police finally started their investigation, and once the investigation was fully mobilized, its scale was extraordinary. Hundreds of police officers were assigned full-time to the search. Cook County officers were assisted by colleagues from surrounding suburbs. A dedicated task force was formed with the sole purpose of locating Barbara and Patricia Grimes. On the ground, hundreds of local volunteers joined the effort. Police conducted door-to-door canvassing throughout Brighton Park and McKinley Park. Canals and rivers were dredged. More than 15,000 flyers bearing the girls' photographs were distributed to homes across the city. Parishioners at St. Maurice's Church, the sisters' parish, raised a $1,000 reward for information leading to their whereabouts. Before it was over, 300,000 people would be questioned. 2,000 of those would be subjected to serious interrogation. It was one of the largest missing persons investigations in the history of Cook County. And yet in the weeks that followed, what the investigation produced was not answers but noise. An overwhelming flood of reported sightings, tips, letters, and theories, most of which contradicted each other and none of which could be verified. A bus driver on Archer Avenue said he had seen the girls board his bus after the screening. They had exited at Western Avenue, approximately halfway between the theater and their home, at about 11:05 p.m. Why they would have gotten off at that stop, rather than continuing to the one closer to their house, was never explained. A security guard on the northwest side said he had given directions to two girls matching their description on the morning of the 29th of December, 12 hours after they had left the theater and miles from their neighborhood. He remembered the encounter only because both girls had been unusually rude to him. A friend of Barbara's reported seeing both sisters walking westward on Archer Avenue at 2:30 p.m. on the 29th, as though nothing were wrong, as though they had simply been out for a walk the following afternoon. A classmate of Patricia's was certain she had seen the younger sister walking past a restaurant that evening in the company of two unidentified girls. A railroad conductor reported seeing both girls aboard a train near the Great Lakes Naval Training Center, searching for two sailors named Terry and Larry. On the 1st of January, someone reported seeing them on a bus on Damon Avenue. On the 3rd of January, 3 employees at a Crest department store in Inglewood claimed both girls had spent time at the record counter, listening to Elvis Presley songs. A night clerk at the Unity Hotel on West 61st Street said he had turned away 2 girls because of their age. He believed they had been the Grimes sisters. Adding to the confusion, a woman named Pearl Neville contacted investigators from Nashville, Tennessee. She claimed to have met both girls in a bus station restroom on the 9th of January and to have accompanied them to a state employment agency where they applied for work. A clerk at that agency later identified the sisters from photographs and recalled that both girls had used the surname Grimes on their application forms. The Nashville theory gained traction. Perhaps the girls, obsessed with Elvis, had taken a bus south to find him. Perhaps this was all a misadventure that would end with 2 sheepish teenagers arriving home to their mother. On the 19th of January 1957, a statement was issued from Elvis Presley's Graceland estate. It was televised across Chicago. Presley addressed the sisters directly, stating, "If you are good Presley fans, you'll go home and ease your mother's worries." He also made a direct radio appeal, imploring the girls to return home to their mother. Throughout all of this, Loretta Grimes maintained her position. She did not believe her daughters had run away. She did not believe they were in Nashville. She did not believe they were voluntarily staying with anyone. She pleaded publicly, "If someone is holding them, please let the girls call me." And then she added, "I'll forgive them from the bottom of my heart." Behind the public statements, Loretta was living through a particular kind of agony. The kind where you know something is wrong, where every instinct tells you the worst has happened, but the world around you keeps offering hope that you cannot bring yourself to accept. 25 days would pass between the night her daughters left for the movies and the moment she would learn what happened to them. 25 days of reported sightings, of false leads, of ransom letters that led nowhere, of tips that dissolved upon investigation, and of a city slowly coming to terms with the possibility that 2 girls had not run away at all, that they had been taken. On the 22nd of January 1957, the weather in Chicago shifted. A rapid thaw had set in over the previous few days, melting the heavy snowfall that had blanketed the region since early January. Roads that had been buried for weeks were suddenly visible again. Ditches and embankments that had been smooth and white now showed their contours. At around noon that day, a 39-year-old construction worker named Leonard Prescott was driving along a rural stretch of road called German Church Road near the unincorporated community of Willow Springs. He was on his way to buy groceries. As he passed a guardrail approximately 200 feet east of County Line Road, something caught his eye. Behind the rail, on a flat section of snow-covered ground that dropped away toward the embankment of Devil's Creek, he saw what he later described as these flesh-colored things. He wasn't sure what he was looking at. His first thought was that they might be mannequins, store dummies that someone had discarded on the roadside. He drove home. He told his wife Marie what he had seen. Then he drove back with her to take a closer look. Marie Prescott got out of the car and approached the guardrail. Then Leonard had to carry her back. What lay behind that guardrail were the nude, frozen bodies of Barbara and Patricia Grimes. They had been placed or thrown onto the flat ground just beyond the rail. The guardrail itself extended for only about 10 feet before the terrain dropped sharply into the embankment. Barbara lay on her left side, her legs drawn slightly up toward her torso. Patricia lay on her back, her body partially covering her sister's head, her own head turned sharply to the right. They were unclothed. No items of their clothing would ever be found. The Prescotts contacted the Willow Springs Police Department immediately. When investigators arrived, they found a scene that offered remarkably little. The bodies were frozen solid, preserved by weeks of sub-zero temperatures. The surrounding ground was snow-covered and largely featureless. There were no obvious items of evidence nearby. No clothing, no personal effects, no weapon, no clear tire tracks. It was believed that the sisters had most likely been driven to this location in a car, and that their bodies had then been dragged or lifted from the vehicle and placed or thrown behind the guardrail. But beyond that basic reconstruction, the scene yielded almost nothing. The girl's father, Joseph Grimes, was driven to the location to formally identify the bodies. He arrived, looked briefly at what lay behind the guardrail, and said simply, "Yes, they are my daughters." Then he slumped forward in tears and had to be supported from the scene by police officers. In the hours that followed, over 160 police officers from several suburban departments conducted a search of the surrounding area, assisted by local volunteers and the forest preserves. They found little or nothing of evidentiary value, and the search itself would later be criticized for the same reason so many crime scenes of this era were compromised. Untrained volunteers were allowed to walk through the area, potentially destroying whatever trace evidence might have been preserved beneath the melting snow. The location was approximately 15 miles from the Brighton Theater, where the girls had last been seen alive. It was a remote, rural stretch of road, the kind of place you would only go to if you knew it was there. Not a main highway, not a route anyone would take by accident. Whoever had left them there had chosen the spot deliberately. When Loretta Grimes received word that 2 female bodies had been discovered, she already knew. Before Joseph returned from the scene, before any official confirmation reached her, she knew. "You wouldn't believe me," she said to the police through tears. She had been telling them for nearly 4 weeks that her daughters had not run away. That something terrible had happened, that the sightings were wrong, that the Nashville theory was wrong, that every reassuring explanation was wrong. She had been right all along. The autopsies were performed the day after the discovery by 3 experienced forensic pathologists. Each body was examined for 5 hours. At the end of those examinations, the 3 experts could not agree on a cause of death. They could not agree on a date of death. And the conclusions they did reach would be challenged almost immediately, not by outsiders, but by one of their own colleagues. What the pathologists determined was this: neither girl had been strangled, neither had been shot or stabbed, neither had been drugged or poisoned. Toxicology reports came back clean. No obviously fatal wounds were found on either body. The girls' stomach contents still contained the approximate proportions of the last known meals and snacks they had eaten on the evening of the 28th of December, their dinner at home, and the popcorn at the theater. Based on this, the pathologists concluded that both girls had most likely died within approximately 5 hours of the time they were last seen alive. That placed the time of death on either the late evening of the 28th of December or the early morning of the 29th. There were injuries. Bruises were found on Patricia's face and body. Marks resembling blunt force trauma were visible on Barbara's face and head. 3 small puncture wounds, resembling those made by an ice pick or similar instrument, were found on Barbara's chest, but none of these injuries were considered severe enough to have caused death. The pathologists also concluded that many of the marks on the bodies had been inflicted by rodents after death, and that the puncture wounds had most likely been inflicted post-mortem as well. The bodies were described as markedly clean. No dirt, no debris, no obvious signs of a struggle preserved on the skin. In the end, the official cause of death for both girls was listed as murder, the specific means being secondary shock, resulting from exposure to temperatures that had reduced their body temperatures below the level compatible with life. In simpler terms, the official conclusion was that they had been left in the cold and had frozen to death. The death certificates were filed, the case had its official answer, and then Harry Glowes destroyed it. Glowes was the chief investigator for the Cook County Coroner's Office. He was aggressive, outspoken, and utterly convinced that the official findings were wrong. His first objection was about the time of death. Glowes pointed to a thin layer of ice that had been found encrusted upon the sisters' bodies. He argued that this ice could only have formed if the bodies had been warm when they were deposited on German Church Road, and that this was only possible after the 7th of January, when sufficient snowfall had occurred to create such a layer upon contact with body heat. If Glowes was right, the girls had been alive for at least 10 days after they left the theater. The stomach contents analysis was wrong, or had been misinterpreted, or the girls had simply not eaten during whatever ordeal they had endured. His second objection was about the nature of the injuries. Glowes insisted that the marks on the girls' faces were not rodent bites. They were signs of violence inflicted before death. He believed both sisters had been beaten. His third objection was the most inflammatory. Glowes stated publicly that both girls had been subjected to sexual assaults. He claimed that the autopsy of Patricia had discovered semen within vaginal fluid swabbed from her body. He also claimed that curdled milk had been found in Barbara's stomach, milk that she was not known to have drunk either at home or at the cinema on the night of her disappearance. If true, this meant she had consumed something after leaving the theater, which contradicted the official timeline entirely. Glowes accused the pathologists of suppressing these findings. He claimed they had refused to disclose the full details of what had been done to the girls, possibly to protect the sisters' reputations or to spare their mother's feelings. His words were blunt. The pathologists, he said, had taken the girls off Madison Street and put them into respectability. Coroner Walter McCarran responded by firing Glowes on the 15th of February. He accused Glowes of being publicity mad and lacking expertise in forensic science. Police investigators complained that Glowes had undermined their work by publicly revealing details, specifically the evidence of sexual activity, that they had hoped to use during interrogations of suspects. Glowes insisted his firing was politically motivated. He refused to stop working the case. Sheriff Joseph Lohman, who shared Glowes' belief that the girls had been beaten, tortured, and murdered by a sexual predator who had lured them into a vehicle, deputized Glowes to continue investigating without pay. The result was an investigation fractured at its core. The official position held that the girls had died the night they disappeared, from exposure, with no clear evidence of prolonged captivity or extreme violence. The dissenting position held that they had been held for days or weeks, that they had been assaulted repeatedly, and that someone had covered it up. These two versions of events have never been reconciled. To this day, there is no consensus on when Barbara and Patricia Grimes actually died, or on what was done to them in the hours or days between their disappearance and their deaths. The people who should have been working together to solve the case were instead fighting each other in the press. And while they fought, whoever had left those two girls on German Church Road remained free. Two days after the bodies were discovered, a tip came in from the owners of a Skid Row restaurant on West Madison Street. John and Minnie Duros ran the D&L restaurant at 1340 West Madison, a diner that served the transients, drifters, and day laborers who populated Chicago's roughest stretch. On the 24th of January, they contacted police to report something they had seen nearly a month earlier. In the early morning hours of the 30th of December, 2 days after the sisters disappeared, the Duroses said they had observed two girls in their restaurant who physically resembled Barbara and Patricia Grimes. The girls had been accompanied by two young men. One of the girls, the taller one, appeared to be either drunk or sick. She was staggering. She could barely hold herself upright. According to many Duros, the group had sat in a booth and listened to Elvis Presley songs on the jukebox. At one point, the taller girl put her head down on the table. The men tried to get her into a car outside. She resisted. Eventually, all four left together. Many Duros recalled one detail. On their way out, the shorter girl said they were sisters. A patron named René Eccles corroborated the Duros' account. The young man the witnesses identified was Edward Lee Bedwell. He went by Benny. He was 21 years old, semi-literate, originally from Tennessee. He had been evicted from his family's home the previous November and had been earning occasional money as a part-time dishwasher at various Skid Row establishments. Bedwell was tall. He bore a noticeable resemblance to Elvis Presley. Police arrested him and subjected him to 3 days of interrogation. Initially, Bedwell was insistent. He admitted he had been in the restaurant with two girls and another man. But he denied the girls were the Grimes sisters. He said the Duroses were mistaken. On the 27th of January, 1957, Bedwell signed a 14-page confession. In it, he stated that he and a 28-year-old acquaintance named William Cole Willingham had been in the company of the Grimes sisters beginning on the 30th of December. He said they had spent roughly a week together, drinking in various saloons along West Madison Street, sleeping in flop houses. He said the girls had been willing participants. Then he said on the 7th of January, after he and Willingham had given the girls hot dogs, both sisters refused their sexual advances. Bedwell said they knocked the girls unconscious, removed their clothing, and threw their nude bodies into a snow-filled ditch alongside German Church Road. When asked about his motivations, Bedwell told the Chicago Daily Tribune, "If I hadn't been drinking, I wouldn't have done what I'd done, and what I'd done I didn't do intentionally." He was formally charged with murder. Loretta Grimes heard the confession and responded immediately. "It's a lie," she said. "My girls wouldn't be on West Madison Street. They didn't even know where it was." She was not the only one who doubted it. Willingham admitted he had been with Bedwell and two girls in the early hours of the 30th of December. But he denied the girls were the Grimes sisters. He denied any involvement in the murders. Two teenage cousins named Irene Dean and Carol King later came forward and told investigators that they had likely been the two girls in the restaurant that morning. Dean stated she had been Bedwell's date that night. Many Duros acknowledged she had seen Dean in the restaurant on other occasions, though never with Bedwell. Then the forensic evidence collapsed the confession entirely. The autopsy had found no alcohol in either girl's system, no hot dogs in either girl's stomach. The stomach contents matched only what they had eaten at home and at the theater on the night of the 28th of December. If Bedwell's story were true, if the girls had spent a week eating, drinking, and moving through the city, their digestive systems would have reflected that. They did not. Furthermore, factory time cards from the Ajax Consolidated Company showed that Bedwell had been clocked in at work from 4:19 p.m. on the 28th of December until 12:30 a.m. on the 29th, covering the most likely window of the sisters' abduction. Additional records confirmed he had been working in Cicero on the date he claimed to have killed them. At a 3-day habeas corpus hearing beginning on the 31st of January, Bedwell recanted everything. He testified that he had fabricated the entire confession. He said he had been threatened, struck, and bribed during his interrogation. He said one captain had pushed him against a wall and called him a bum, then offered him a new suit of clothes if he would tell them what they wanted to hear. He said he had constructed the story from his experiences with other girls, simply substituting the Grimes sisters into a narrative that had nothing to do with them. He said he confessed because he believed the police would let him go if he did. On the 6th of February, Bedwell was released on bond. On the 4th of March, all charges were formally dropped. The inconsistencies between his confession and the physical evidence were too numerous to sustain a prosecution. It was also noted in official records that Bedwell had been classified as a mentally retarded individual. At the coroner's inquest, Loretta Grimes demanded permission to ask her own questions. Among them, our girls looked like children and did not look fully mature and physically developed for their age. How could they be taken by saloon keepers as adults? Would a tavern keeper risk his license selling liquor to mere children? And then she did something that no one expected. She spotted Bedwell's mother, Ethel Bradbury, in the hearing room. She crossed the room, took the weeping woman's hands in hers, and said softly, "I don't think your boy did it. We want you to know how sorry we are." Loretta Grimes, whose 2 daughters were dead and whose grief was bottomless, offered comfort to the mother of the man who had just confessed to killing them. Because she knew the confession was not real. She knew her daughters had never been on West Madison Street. And she knew that whatever had actually happened to Barbara and Patricia, the answer was not sitting in that courtroom. It was still out there. With the collapse of the case against Bedwell, the investigation had no center. Suspects accumulated, but none of them held. The first had come even before Bedwell. On the 15th of January, 1957, a week before the bodies were discovered, a switchboard operator at Chicago's Central Police Complaint Room received a phone call from a man who refused to give his name. He said both girls were dead. He said their bodies could be found in an unincorporated area of Leon Township. He said the information had come to him in a dream. Police traced the call to a location near the home of Walter Krantz, a 53-year-old steamfitter. When questioned, Krantz said his family had a history of psychic abilities and that the vision had come to him after a night of heavy drinking. The area Krantz described in his phone call was approximately 1 mile from the actual location where the girls' bodies would be found 1 week later. Handwriting experts determined that Krantz may also have written a ransom note that Loretta Grimes had received during the weeks her daughters were missing. He was considered the police department's #1 suspect for a time. He was interrogated repeatedly. But no physical evidence connected him to the crime. He was released. Then there was Max Flagg. He was 17 years old. He was considered one of the prime suspects early in the investigation, though the specific reasons for this suspicion were never made fully public. Under Illinois law at the time, juveniles could not be subjected to polygraph examinations. However, Chicago Police Captain Ralph Pedak persuaded Flagg to submit to an unofficial test, one that would carry no legal weight but might yield information. Flagg agreed, and during that unofficial polygraph, he allegedly confessed to the murders. But the confession was legally worthless. It could not be used as evidence. No physical evidence corroborated what Flagg had said. Police had no choice but to release him. Years later, Max Flagg would be convicted of the unrelated murder of a young woman. Whether his confession in the Grimes case was genuine or not has never been determined. Beyond these named suspects, there were other leads that surfaced and disappeared. An anonymous letter arrived at the offices of Chicago Sun-Times advice columnist Ann Landers shortly after Elvis Presley's public appeal. It was allegedly written by a girl who claimed to have witnessed the sisters being forced into a car by a young man on the night of their disappearance. The letter included a partial license plate number. The first 4 digits were 2184. The writer said she and a friend had exchanged phone numbers with the Grimes sisters outside the theater, and that as they parted ways, a man approximately 22 to 25 years old had pushed Barbara into the back seat and Patricia into the front seat of a car. Police attempted to trace the vehicle. They failed. The author of the letter was never identified. Several teenagers who had been at the Brighton Theater that night reported seeing the sisters in the company of boys near cars, a green Buick, a black 1949 Mercury. 2 boys named Ed Lorden and Earl Zastro had seen the sisters 2 blocks from home at 11:30 p.m. Other boys had been in the same area at the same time, arriving home from a night of driving around with girls in a car. These threads overlapped in ways that investigators noted but could never connect definitively to the crime. The boys were questioned, all were cleared. And then, after the investigation had gone quiet, something happened that changed the texture of the entire case. In May of 1957, approximately 3 months after the bodies were found, Loretta Grimes received a phone call. The caller was male. He said he knew who had killed her daughters. He said he had been the one who undressed them. Then he said something that stopped Loretta cold. I know something about your little girl that no one else knows, not even the police. The smallest girl's toes were crossed at the feet. Barbara, the older of the two, but smaller in stature, had a minor physical deformity. Her toes were crossed. This was not public information. It had never been released to the press. It was not in any newspaper account. The caller laughed, then he hung up. Loretta would never forget that voice. 18 months later, in November of 1958, it returned. On the 15th of November, a group of Boy Scouts on a nature hike in the forest preserves of Palos Hills discovered the body of a young girl. She was 15 years old. Her name was Bonnie Lee Scott. She had been missing since September. Her body was found less than 10 miles from where the Grimes sisters had been left on German Church Road. The day after Bonnie Lee Scott's body was discovered, Loretta Grimes received another phone call. She was certain it was the same voice. This time, the caller boasted with the words, "I've committed another perfect crime. This is another one those cops won't solve, and they're not going to hook it on to Bedwell or Barry Cook." Then he laughed the same way he had laughed before. Loretta was adamant until her death that both calls came from the same person. The same voice, the same cruelty, the same laughter. The man convicted of killing Bonnie Lee Scott was a 23-year-old named Charles Leroy Melquist. Melquist had met Scott at a carnival when she was 14 and he was 20. He had positioned himself as a kind of older brother figure to her. After her disappearance in September of 1958, he had driven her grandmother around the neighborhood looking for her, all while, according to his later confession, her body lay in the forest preserve where he had left it. He confessed to killing Scott by smothering her with a satin pillow. He confessed to returning to her body weeks later with a knife because of an overwhelming urge to cut. He confessed to decapitating her. When investigators examined Melquist's home, they found a list of phone numbers belonging to numerous teenage girls. Among them were the numbers of two girls who had been neighbors of the Grimes sisters, who had frequented the same shops, swum in the same park, and attended the same theater on Archer Avenue. The similarities between the Scott murder and the Grimes case were difficult to ignore. Both victims were teenage girls. Both were found nude. Both were left just over a guardrail on a remote road. The two dump sites were less than a mile apart. In neither case could a definitive cause of death be established. Melquist's method, suffocation, was consistent with a death that would leave no obvious fatal wound, the same absence that had baffled the pathologists who examined Barbara and Patricia. A psychiatrist who examined Melquist stated publicly that when the Grimes killer was found, he would be the same type of person as Charles Melquist. But Melquist was never questioned about the Grimes sisters. His attorney forbade it. He was convicted of the Scott murder, sentenced to 99 years, and served less than 9. He died in 2010. He was never charged in connection with the deaths of Barbara and Patricia Grimes, and the case remains open. No one was ever convicted, not the drifter who confessed and recanted, not the steamfitter who dreamed of the location, not the teenager whose polygraph confession could not be used, not the convicted child killer whose method and geography matched so closely that a psychiatrist all but named him. In 1989, Loretta Grimes died. She had spent 33 years standing watch at her living room window, walking the neighborhood with her head down and her shoulders bent, and telling anyone who would listen that she would never forget that voice on the telephone. She never learned who it belonged to. That's the story of what happened to Barbara and Patricia Grimes. The disappearance, the search, the discovery on a frozen roadside, and the investigation that produced confessions, accusations, and political warfare, but never a conviction. But knowing the facts doesn't answer the questions that sit beneath them, the ones that have kept people returning to this case for nearly 70 years. How do you kill two people and leave no detectable wound? Why did an entire city report seeing two girls who were almost certainly already dead? What does it mean that a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old got into a car on a freezing night, and what kind of person could make them do that? And why did someone call their mother, months later, to prove he had been there? In part 2, we're going to go through the psychology behind this case. Not to solve it, but to understand what the details left behind reveal about the kind of mind that did this, and why this particular crime still refuses to release the city where it happened. Three experienced forensic pathologists spent 5 hours examining each body. They found bruises. They found small puncture marks. They found evidence of exposure to extreme cold, but they could not find what killed Barbara and Patricia Grimes. No strangulation marks, no gunshot wounds, no stabbing, no poison, no drugs, no blunt force trauma severe enough to be fatal. In the end, they ruled the cause of death as secondary shock from exposure, freezing, arrived at not by positive identification, but by a process of elimination. They could not determine what had killed the girls, so they concluded it must have been the cold. This absence is not just a forensic puzzle, it is a psychological signature. In criminal behavioral analysis, there is an important distinction between killers who leave obvious evidence of their method and those who do not. A gunshot, a ligature, a knife wound, these are traces that tell investigators exactly what happened and often provide physical evidence that can be linked back to a specific person or weapon. A killer who leaves no detectable cause of death is a different kind of mind entirely. There are very few methods of killing a human being that leave no obvious forensic trace. Suffocation with a soft object, a pillow, a cloth, a piece of fabric, is one of them. In cases of soft suffocation, particularly when the victim is young or physically slight, there may be no bruising around the nose or mouth, no petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes, no damage to the hyoid bone. The body simply stops breathing, and what remains afterward looks like a person who died of nothing. This is precisely what the pathologists found: two girls who were dead, with no clear explanation of how they had gotten that way. Charles Melquist, the convicted killer of Bonnie Lee Scott, confessed to smothering his victim with a satin pillow. He described holding it over her head and face until she stopped moving. When he removed it, she appeared simply to have fallen asleep. Scott's official autopsy was similarly inconclusive regarding cause of death. Suffocation was suspected, but could not be definitively proven. Whether or not Melquist was responsible for the Grimes sisters' deaths, the method attributed to him is consistent with the forensic findings in their case. And the psychological implications of choosing such a method are significant. A killer who uses suffocation, particularly soft suffocation, is exercising a very specific kind of control. It is an intimate method. It requires close physical proximity to the victim. It requires patience. And it requires a willingness to sustain the act over a prolonged period rather than end it in an instant. But perhaps more importantly, it is a method chosen by someone who is thinking about what happens afterward, about what the body will show, about what investigators will be able to determine. A person who shoots or stabs is acting in a way that prioritizes the moment of killing. A person who suffocates with a soft object is acting in a way that prioritizes concealment. This suggests a mind that is not merely impulsive or reactive, it suggests forethought. An awareness that there will be an investigation, that there will be an examination of the body, and a deliberate choice of method designed to frustrate that examination. The removal of the girl's clothing reinforces this interpretation. Clothing carries trace evidence: fibers, hairs, skin cells, biological fluids. In 1956, forensic technology was limited compared to modern capabilities, but the basic principle was well understood even then. Removing the victim's clothing and ensuring it was never found was a forensic countermeasure. Someone was thinking about what the police would look for and was removing it in advance. The fact that the bodies were described as markedly clean adds another layer. These girls had not been found in the state one would expect if they had been subjected to prolonged violence or killed in a chaotic struggle. Someone had taken care with them, not care in the compassionate sense, but care in the sense of deliberation, of managing the scene, of presenting investigators with as little as possible to work with. Taken together, these details point toward a killer operating with a level of sophistication that is psychologically distinctive. This was not someone acting in a frenzy. This was not a crime of passion that spiraled out of control. This was someone who had thought about how to kill without leaving a mark, how to dispose of bodies without leaving a trail, and how to ensure that even if the victims were found, the method of their death would remain undetectable. And for nearly 70 years it has. Between the night of the 28th of December, 1956, and the discovery of the bodies on the 22nd of January, 1957, dozens of people reported seeing Barbara and Patricia Grimes alive. A bus driver, a security guard, a classmate, restaurant employees, hotel clerks, a railroad conductor, a woman in Nashville, 3 workers at a department store. These were not anonymous tips from strangers calling in on a hotline. Many of these witnesses were specific, detailed, and certain. They described the girls' clothing, their behavior, their interactions. Some of them knew the sisters personally. And yet the forensic evidence, the stomach contents, the state of the bodies, the pathologist's conclusions, strongly suggested that both girls had died within 5 hours of leaving the Brighton Theater. That they were dead before midnight on the 28th of December, or in the earliest hours of the 29th. If that timeline is correct, then every single one of those sightings was wrong. Dozens of people, over a period of 25 days, were looking at other girls and seeing Barbara and Patricia Grimes. Is something like that even remotely possible? In psychology, there is a well-documented phenomenon known as confirmation bias in perception. When the brain is primed to look for something, when it has been told that 2 specific girls are missing, when their photographs have been published on every front page, when 15,000 flyers bearing their faces have been distributed to homes across the city, it begins to find what it is looking for, whether or not it is actually there. The human brain is not a camera. It does not passively record what it sees. It actively constructs perception based on expectation, context, and emotional state. When a person is aware that 2 teenage sisters are missing, and they encounter 2 girls of roughly the right age and description in a public place, the brain does not simply note the resemblance. It fills in the gaps. It resolves ambiguity in the direction of the expected outcome. It sees what it has been told to look for. This is not a failure of intelligence or attentiveness. It is a fundamental feature of how human perception works, and it becomes dramatically more powerful under conditions of emotional intensity, precisely the conditions that existed in Chicago during those 25 days. The Grimes sisters were not just missing persons. They were a citywide obsession. Their faces were everywhere. Their story was discussed in every home, every school, every church. The emotional stakes were enormous. 2 young girls, possibly in danger, possibly still alive, possibly still savable. Under those conditions, the threshold for identification drops dramatically. A person does not need to see Barbara and Patricia Grimes. They need to see 2 girls who could be Barbara and Patricia Grimes. And in a city of 3.5 million people, there were thousands of pairs of girls who could fit that description on any given day. But there is another layer to this phenomenon that goes beyond simple misidentification. In cases of missing children, reported sightings serve a psychological function for the community itself. Each sighting is, in a sense, a form of hope. As long as someone has seen the girls at a bus station, in a department store, on a train, they are still alive. The narrative remains open. The worst has not yet happened. The alternative, that the girls were already dead, that they had been dead since the first night, that every day of searching and pleading and praying had been directed at empty air, is psychologically devastating. It means the community failed. It means the police failed. It means Loretta's instinct was right from the beginning and no one listened. Reported sightings in this context function as a collective defense mechanism. They keep the story in a tolerable emotional register. They maintain the possibility of a good outcome, and they allow people to feel that their vigilance matters, that by watching, by looking, by reporting, they are contributing to the girls' safe return. This is why the sightings persisted for so long, not because the witnesses were lying and not necessarily because they were wrong, but because the psychological need for the girls to still be alive was so powerful that the entire city unconsciously cooperated in sustaining that belief. When the bodies were found, all of those sightings collapsed at once. The bus driver, the hotel clerk, the woman in Nashville, all of them had to reconcile what they had seen with a reality that made their observations impossible. Some could not. Harry Glowes, the coroner's investigator, built his entire dissenting theory on the sightings. He argued that the girls must have been alive until at least the 7th of January because people had seen them. His ice layer theory, his claims of prolonged captivity, his insistence that the pathologists were wrong, all of it rested on the assumption that the witnesses were correct. But the stomach contents tell a different story. A story in which 2 girls ate dinner at home, ate popcorn at the theater, and then died before consuming anything else. A story in which the 25 days of sightings were 25 days of a city seeing what it desperately needed to see. The psychological weight of this is considerable. It means that for nearly a month, while hundreds of police officers searched and Loretta Grimes stood at her window and Elvis Presley went on the radio, Barbara and Patricia were already lying behind a guardrail on German Church Road, covered by snow, invisible, gone. The city was looking everywhere. They were already there. Loretta Grimes said it plainly 1 year after her daughters were found. Her girls would never have entered a vehicle driven by someone they did not know. She was certain of this. The weather that night had been bitterly cold, cold enough that anyone standing on a dark street at 11 o'clock would have felt the pull of a warm car and offered ride, a shortcut home. But Loretta knew her daughters. She knew that the cold alone would not have been enough to override their caution. If they got into a car, it was because they recognized the person driving it. This is not simply a mother's intuition. It is consistent with what criminologists and behavioral researchers have documented extensively about how predators who target adolescent victims actually operate. In the study of predatory violence against young people, there is a pattern that appears again and again. The perpetrator is not a stranger lurking in an alley. He is someone known or at least familiar, someone the victims have seen before, someone who occupies a space in their world that registers as safe or at least not threatening. This is sometimes referred to as trust-based predation. The predator does not rely on force or surprise to gain access to his victims. He relies on a pre-existing relationship, however shallow, that lowers the victim's defenses at the critical moment. In the Grimes case, multiple witnesses described cars stopping alongside the sisters as they walked home from the theater. A green Buick, a black 1949 Mercury, young men inside, the girls hesitated, they giggled, they kept walking. This is a significant detail. It tells us that Barbara and Patricia were approached by strangers that night and declined. They had the instinct, they had the caution. The fact that they did not get into those cars demonstrates that their mother was right. They were not the kind of girls who would accept a ride from anyone. Which means that whoever they did get into a car with, if that is what happened, was someone who had already passed through their filter. Someone whose presence did not trigger the alarm that the other cars had triggered. In behavioral analysis, predators who target adolescents in this way are often described as operating within the victim's social periphery. They are not family, they are not close friends, but they are present at the edges of the victim's world, perhaps an older boy from the neighborhood, perhaps someone seen at the local shops, at the park, at the theater. Perhaps someone who had spoken to them before, who had established a baseline of familiarity over days or weeks, without ever doing anything overtly threatening. This is the psychology of grooming in its broadest sense, not necessarily the prolonged, deliberate grooming that the term often implies, but the simpler process by which a predator makes himself a known quantity in a potential victim's environment. He becomes someone who has been seen before, someone who does not need to explain his presence, someone whose offer of a ride on a freezing night feels like a courtesy rather than a danger. And there is one additional factor that made Barbara and Patricia particularly vulnerable at that specific moment. They were 2 blocks from home. This is a detail that seems to argue against danger. They were almost there, almost safe. But psychologically, it operates in the opposite direction. The closer a person is to home, the more their vigilance decreases. The brain registers proximity to safety and begins to relax its threat assessment. A car that might seem suspicious 5 miles from home might feel entirely benign 200 yards from your front door. This is sometimes called the threshold effect in victimology. The moment of greatest vulnerability is often not in the unfamiliar place, but in the transition between the unfamiliar and the familiar, the last stretch, the final block, the space between the public world and the private one. Barbara and Patricia were in that space. They had navigated the walk from the theater. They had declined at least 2 cars full of strangers. They were giggling, jumping out of doorways at each other, relaxed and playful. They were 2 blocks from home, and they had let their guard down, not because they were careless, but because everything in their environment was telling them they were safe. If someone pulled up at that moment, someone they recognized, someone whose face was familiar from the neighborhood, someone who said the right thing in the right tone, the girl's natural caution may have been insufficient to protect them. Not because they were naive, but because the architecture of the situation was designed, whether consciously or not, to neutralize exactly the kind of wariness they had already demonstrated. The cold made it worse, a freezing night, a warm car, a familiar face, and 2 blocks still to walk, everything converging toward the same decision, the one that in hindsight was the only wrong one they made all night. And it is worth noting one final psychological dimension. There were 2 of them, 2 sisters together should be safer than 1 girl alone, and in most circumstances they would be. But the presence of a companion can also reduce an individual's threat perception. If your sister is getting into the car, it must be safe. If she is not alarmed, you should not be alarmed either. The social proof of the other person's calm functions as reassurance, even when that reassurance is unwarranted. Barbara and Patricia protected each other every day of their lives. On the night of the 28th of December, 1956, their closeness may have been the very thing that made them both vulnerable to the same moment of misplaced trust. The way a killer disposes of a body tells investigators something that the act of killing itself often cannot. The murder may be impulsive, chaotic, driven by rage or panic, but the disposal happens afterward, in the quiet that follows, when the killer is alone with what he has done and must make decisions about what to do next. Those decisions reveal things about his mind that the violence itself may obscure. Barbara and Patricia Grimes were found nude, frozen, and positioned together behind a guard rail on a remote stretch of road 15 miles from where they were last seen alive. Each element of that sentence carries psychological weight. The nudity is the first question. In cases of sexual homicide, the removal of clothing is often assumed to be connected to the sexual assault itself, a byproduct of the act that preceded the killing. But in the Grimes case, the forensic picture is ambiguous. There was evidence of sexual activity involving Barbara. The findings regarding Patricia were disputed between officials. What is not disputed is that both girls were completely unclothed when found, and that no items of their clothing were ever recovered. In behavioral analysis, the complete removal and disappearance of a victim's clothing can serve 2 distinct purposes, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is forensic. Clothing is one of the richest sources of trace evidence in any crime. Fibers from a car interior, hairs from the perpetrator, biological fluids, soil or pollen that could identify a location where the victim was held. By removing the clothing and disposing of it separately, ensuring it was never found, the killer was eliminating an entire category of evidence. This is a calculated act. It requires the presence of mind to think beyond the immediate moment and anticipate what investigators will look for. The second purpose is psychological. In cases where victims are left nude in a public or semi-public location, the nudity itself can function as a statement. It is a final act of power over the victim, a reduction of the person to a body stripped of identity, of dignity, of the social markers that made them who they were. It says, I controlled this. I decided how you would be found. I decided what you would look like when the world saw you again. Whether the killer in this case was motivated primarily by forensic calculation, by a need for psychological dominance, or by some combination of both, the effect was the same. When Leonard Prescott spotted the forms behind the guard rail, what he saw was not 2 missing girls. He saw shapes, objects, things that looked like mannequins. The removal of clothing had, in a literal sense, removed their humanity from the scene before anyone arrived to find them. Then there is the positioning. Barbara lay on her left side, her legs drawn slightly up toward her torso. Patricia lay on her back, her body covering her sister's head, her own head turned sharply to the right. These positions do not suggest bodies that were thrown. A body thrown from a car lands in a way that reflects the physics of the throw, limbs splayed, torso twisted, head at whatever angle gravity and momentum dictated. The positions in which the Grimes sisters were found suggest something more deliberate. They suggest placement. In criminal psychology, there is a distinction between dumping and posing. Dumping is purely practical. The killer needs to get rid of the body and does so with as little investment as possible. Posing is different. It involves arranging the body in a specific way that means something to the killer, even if that meaning is not immediately apparent to anyone else. The Grimes sisters occupy a space between these 2 categories. Their bodies were not elaborately staged. There was no theatricality to the scene, no symbolic arrangement that announced a message to the world. But neither were they simply discarded. The fact that Patricia's body covered Barbara's head, that the 2 sisters were positioned in relation to each other, suggests someone who took a moment to arrange them, who made a decision about how they would lie together. Whether this was a remnant of guilt, a final exercise of control, or simply the byproduct of how two bodies were lowered out of a vehicle in sequence, it is impossible to know for certain. But the impression it creates is one of deliberateness rather than panic. And then there is the location itself. German Church Road was rural, isolated, and remote. It was not a main highway. It was not a place anyone would pass through by accident or discover quickly. The killer chose a spot that was hidden from casual view by a guardrail and an embankment, and that would be further concealed by snowfall in the days and weeks that followed. This is consistent with a killer who wanted time. Not time to escape. 15 miles from the scene of an abduction is not a significant distance in terms of flight, but time before the bodies were found. Time during which the investigation would remain a missing persons case rather than a murder investigation. Time during which witnesses would continue reporting sightings. Time during which the trail would grow colder and the evidence would degrade. The snow cooperated. For 25 days, the bodies lay behind that guardrail, buried under a layer of white, invisible to the cars that passed on the road above them. The freezing temperatures preserved them while simultaneously making forensic analysis more difficult, narrowing the information that the bodies could yield, complicating the determination of time of death, and reducing the likelihood of finding trace evidence on the skin. The killer may not have planned for the snow specifically, but he chose a location and a season that maximized his chances of remaining undetected. And that is, in itself, a form of psychological sophistication that separates this crime from an impulsive act. Everything about the disposal, the nudity, the missing clothing, the remote location, the positioning, the reliance on weather and time to do the work of concealment, points to a mind that was thinking clearly in the aftermath of what it had done. In May of 1957, 3 months after her daughter's bodies were found, Loretta Grimes picked up the telephone and heard a man's voice. He did not identify himself. He said he knew who had killed her daughters. He said he had been the one who undressed them. And then he told her something that no one outside the family could have known, that her smaller daughter's toes were crossed at the feet. Then he laughed and he hung up. 18 months later, the day after Bonnie Lee Scott's body was discovered less than 10 miles from where Barbara and Patricia had been found, Loretta received another call. The same voice. The same laughter, this time boasting of a second perfect crime that the police would never solve. Loretta was certain until the day she died that both calls came from the same person, and that this person was the man who had killed her daughters. These phone calls are not just cruel, they are psychologically revealing. In the study of violent criminal behavior, post-offense communication, contact initiated by the killer with the victim's family, with investigators, or with the media after the crime has been committed, is a recognized behavioral pattern. It is not common. The majority of killers, even serial offenders, do not contact the families of their victims. But when it does occur, it tells us something specific about the psychological architecture of the person doing it. The most important thing it tells us is that the crime is not over for him. For most people, a completed act recedes into the past. It was done, it is finished. The mind moves forward, but for certain offenders, the act of killing is not the endpoint of the psychological experience. It is the beginning of a longer process, one that includes reliving, savoring, and extending the emotional aftermath. Contacting the victim's family is one way of extending that aftermath. It allows the killer to re-enter the emotional world of the crime, not through memory alone, but through real-time interaction with someone who is still suffering because of what he did. It is a way of refreshing the experience, of confirming that the impact is ongoing, of reminding himself that he caused something that is still echoing through someone else's life. In psychological terms, this is sometimes described as a need for narcissistic supply. The killer derives a sense of power, significance, or pleasure from the knowledge that his actions are still causing pain, and the phone call is the mechanism through which he verifies this. But the calls to Loretta Grimes contain something beyond the generic desire to cause suffering. They contain specific knowledge. The detail about Barbara's crossed toes is what transforms these calls from possible hoaxes into something far more disturbing. This was not public information. It was not in any newspaper. It had never been disclosed by police. The only people who would have known about this deformity were family members, the pathologists who examined the body, and the person who had undressed her. By revealing this detail, the caller was not simply taunting Loretta, he was proving something. He was establishing, beyond reasonable doubt, that he was who he claimed to be. He was saying, "I was there, I saw what no one else saw, I know what no one else knows." In criminal psychology, this kind of proof offering is associated with a specific psychological need, the need for recognition. Not public recognition necessarily, not fame, but acknowledgement from someone who understands the full weight of what he has done. The audience for these calls was not the police, it was not the media, it was Loretta, the person whose suffering was the most direct and most permanent consequence of his actions. He needed her to know that it was real. That he was real, that the man who had done this to her daughters was not some faceless abstraction, but a specific person who remembered, who carried the details, and who could recall them at will. The laughter is significant as well. Laughter in the context of cruelty, specifically directed at a grieving mother, suggests a capacity for what psychologists call callous unemotional affect. It is not that the caller was unable to understand Loretta's pain. He understood it perfectly. That was the point. The laughter was not a failure of empathy. It was a demonstration of power that derived specifically from the awareness of another person's suffering. This places the caller in a psychological category that is difficult to treat, difficult to predict, and difficult to contain. A person who laughs while delivering proof of his crime to the mother of his victims is someone for whom other people's pain has become a source of gratification, not an unfortunate side effect, not something he pushes out of his mind, but something he seeks out, recreates, and extends. And then there is the second call, the one made after Bonnie Lee Scott's body. And then there is the second call, the one made after Bonnie Lee Scott's body was found. This call changes the picture. It suggests that the person on the other end of the line was not only the killer of Barbara and Patricia Grimes, but a repeat offender. Someone who had killed again, and someone who needed Loretta specifically to know that he had killed again. Why Loretta? Why not the police or the press? Because Loretta was his audience. She was the person through whom he experienced the ongoing reality of what he had done. She was the repository of his significance, and by calling her after his second crime, he was not just boasting. He was maintaining a relationship, a one-sided, parasitic relationship in which her grief was the confirmation of his power. The fact that Loretta recognized the voice without hesitation, that she stated with absolute certainty it was the same person, suggests the voice carried a distinctive quality. Not disguised, not hidden. The caller wanted to be recognizable. He wanted her to know it was the same man. He wanted continuity. This is the psychology of someone who does not merely kill and move on. This is someone who builds an identity around what he has done, and who uses the suffering of others as the mirror in which he sees himself most clearly. Within weeks of the bodies being discovered, the people responsible for solving this case were no longer working together. They were at war. The coroner's office and the sheriff's department held one version of events. The pathologists and the Chicago Police Department held another. Each side accused the other of incompetence, political motivation, or deliberate suppression of evidence. Harry Glowes believed the girls had been held captive for days or weeks, beaten, sexually assaulted, and murdered by a predator. He believed the pathologists had covered up the evidence to protect the girls' reputations. He said so publicly. Coroner Walter McCarran believed the girls had died the night they disappeared from exposure, and that Glowes was a publicity-seeking investigator without the expertise to challenge trained forensic pathologists. He fired Glowes on television. Sheriff Lohman sided with Glowes and deputized him to continue working the case without pay. The police department accused Glowes of undermining their investigation by revealing evidence they had intended to hold back for interrogations. A state senator called for a legislative inquiry. Another senator said Chicago's murders were none of the Senate's business. The American Civil Liberties Union accused the sheriff of violating Bedwell's rights. The press ran banner headlines that changed with every edition. And through all of it, the actual work of identifying and catching a killer was being consumed by institutional dysfunction. This pattern has a name in organizational psychology. It is called goal displacement, a phenomenon in which the original purpose of an organization or investigation is gradually replaced by secondary concerns. The goal is no longer to solve the crime. The goal becomes to win the internal argument, to protect one's institutional reputation, to avoid being the person or department that is blamed when the case collapses. In criminal investigations, goal displacement is particularly destructive because the original goal, identifying the perpetrator, has a limited window of opportunity. Evidence degrades, witnesses forget, suspects establish alibis, and every day that the investigation spends fighting itself rather than pursuing leads is a day that the killer's trail grows colder. But there is a deeper psychological dimension to what happened in the Grimes investigation, and it has to do with the specific nature of the victims. Barbara and Patricia were children. They were 12 and 15. They were from a working-class Catholic neighborhood. Their mother was a devout woman who attended St. Maurice's Church and kept a modest, respectable home. When Harry Glowes stated publicly that both girls had been sexually assaulted, and when rumors began to circulate that the sisters had been seen outside bars, accepting drinks from older men, something happened in the psychology of the investigation that went beyond professional disagreement. The community needed the girls to be innocent. Not because innocence should determine whether a murder is solved, it should not, but because psychologically, the way a community relates to child victims is shaped almost entirely by how it perceives those victims' moral character. A child who is perceived as purely innocent generates maximum collective grief and maximum pressure on authorities to solve the case. A child who is perceived as having participated in risky behavior, even unwillingly, even unknowingly, generates something more complicated. Grief mixed with discomfort, sympathy contaminated by the suggestion that the victims were, in some way, complicit in what happened to them. This is victim blaming in its most insidious form, and in the Grimes case, the fear of it, the fear that the public would blame the girls if the full truth came out, may have been one of the forces driving the suppression of evidence. If the pathologists downplayed or omitted the evidence of sexual assault, they may have done so not out of incompetence, but out of a misguided desire to protect. To keep Barbara and Patricia in the category of innocent victims, to prevent the narrative from shifting from 2 girls were murdered to 2 girls were living a secret life that led to their deaths. Loretta Grimes understood this instinctively. Her questions at the inquest were not just expressions of grief, they were acts of defense. She was fighting to protect the version of her daughters that she knew to be true, ordinary girls, good students, children who collected pictures of Elvis and slid around the kitchen floor in soapy water. And she was right to fight, because once the narrative shifted, once the suggestion of complicity entered the public conversation, the pressure to solve the case diminished. If the girls were not purely innocent, if they had been drinking, if they had been in the company of men, if they had put themselves in danger, then their deaths became something that the public could process without the same urgency. Something tragic but also somehow explicable, something that happens to girls who make certain choices. This is the psychological trap that destroyed the Grimes investigation from within. The officials who suppressed evidence did so to protect the victims, but by suppressing evidence, they denied investigators the complete picture they needed to identify the killer. The officials who revealed evidence did so to pursue justice, but by revealing it publicly, they triggered a shift in the narrative that reduced public pressure and allowed the investigation to stall. Each side was responding to a real psychological dynamic, and each side, in responding, made the situation worse. Meanwhile, the only person who benefited from this internal warfare was the person who had killed Barbara and Patricia. Every day that the investigation spent arguing about autopsy findings and political motivations was a day he remained free. Every column inch devoted to the feud between Glowes and McCarran was a column inch not devoted to pursuing suspects. The killer did not need to do anything to evade justice after the disposal of the bodies. The system did it for him. Loretta Grimes lived for 33 years after her daughters were found on German Church Road. Neighbors remembered seeing her walking the streets of McKinley Park, head down, shoulders bent, always stopping to smile and ask how someone's mother was doing. They remembered her standing at the living room window of the house on South Damon Avenue, watching the street where her daughters had last walked. They sensed that anniversaries were the hardest for her. On the 25th anniversary of the disappearance, she crossed the street to visit a neighbor and wept. She died on the 8th of December, 1989, without ever learning who had killed her daughters. But her grief did not belong to her alone. It belonged to the entire city. In the years after the murders, the Grimes case became something more than an unsolved crime. It became a story that parents told their children. A reason why you couldn't go out after dark, a reason why you couldn't stay out late, a reason why you couldn't walk to the movies alone. One woman who grew up on the West Side, too young to remember the case herself, later recalled, "I heard about that murder all my life. It was my mother's reason why we couldn't go out after dark or stay out late. She scared us with it." Another woman, who was 8 years old and lived southwest of the Grimes neighborhood in 1957, remembered her grandmother cutting clippings from the newspaper. "That murder scared me and my sisters to death," she said. A man who had been 10 years old and lived on the same block as the Grimes family said the case made him afraid to play outside or walk to school. Decades later, he believed he was still unduly wary of strangers because of what had happened when he was a child. A woman who lived on Damon Avenue said simply, "I've never gotten over it. It's part of my identity. I'm the girl who lived on the block where the Grimes girls lived." This is not ordinary memory. This is communal trauma, a psychological wound inflicted not on a single person but on an entire neighborhood, an entire generation, an entire city. In psychology, there is a concept called the shattered assumption. It describes what happens when an event violates a person's fundamental beliefs about the world, beliefs so deep and so basic that the person may not even have been aware they held them until they were destroyed. The belief that children are safe in their own neighborhoods, the belief that a mile-and-a-half walk home from a movie theater is not a dangerous journey, the belief that if two sisters are together, they will protect each other. The belief that in a community like McKinley Park, where everyone knows everyone, where the parish holds people together, where doors are left unlocked, something like this simply cannot happen. The Grimes case shattered all of these assumptions simultaneously. And because the case was never solved, those assumptions were never rebuilt. When a crime is solved, when a killer is identified, arrested, tried, and convicted, the community receives something psychologically essential. It receives containment. The threat is given a name and a face. It is reduced from the vast and unknown to the specific and bounded. It is placed inside a narrative that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The fear is processed, categorized, and eventually filed away. When a crime remains unsolved, none of that happens. The threat remains abstract. It has no face, no name, no story that ends. It stays in the open loop, active, unresolved, demanding attention. The Zeigarnik effect, described by psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik in the 1920s, is the observation that the human mind holds onto unfinished tasks and unresolved stories far longer and far more vividly than completed ones. A finished story is filed away. An unfinished story remains active, circling, resurfacing, pulling at the edges of attention. The Grimes case is an unfinished story that has been circling for nearly 70 years. It is not merely the absence of a conviction that keeps it alive. It is the specific nature of what was lost. Two girls, sisters, children, walking home from a movie on a Friday night, giggling and jumping out of doorways at each other 2 blocks from their front door, and then gone. That image, the ordinariness of it, the closeness of safety, the terrible vulnerability of the final stretch, is what refuses to let people go. It is too easy to see your own children in it. Your own sisters, your own neighborhood. The case does not require imagination to understand. It only requires you to picture someone you love 2 blocks from home on a cold night, and then to imagine them never arriving. The house on South Damon Avenue still stands. The Brighton Theater closed in 1991 and is gone now. St. Maurice's Church is still there. The neighborhood has changed only slightly in the decades since modest homes, well-kept 2 flats, the same quiet residential streets, but people still remember. Leonard Prescott's wife Marie, who fainted when she saw what lay behind that guardrail, spent the rest of her life being asked if she was the woman who found those 2 girls. Her husband never stopped being upset by it. The family that lived near the spot where the bodies were discovered abandoned their home shortly afterward. Furniture and toys were left scattered in the yard, a car rusted in the driveway. Eventually someone set fire to the house. The foundation remained for years, covered in graffiti, visited by teenagers who had heard the story. And in McKinley Park, for decades after the murders, children were told the story of two sisters who went to see Elvis and never came home. Not as history, not as a cautionary tale from some distant era, but as something that happened here, on this street, to people who lived in that house right there. The Grimes case did not just shatter the innocence of a city. It replaced it with something permanent, a quiet, inherited awareness that the world is not as safe as it appears, that 2 blocks from home is not the same as home, and that some stories never end because no one ever found the last page. Loretta knew, she knew from the first night. She knew when she sent Teresa and Joey to the bus stop and they came back alone. She knew through 25 days of sightings and false hopes and Elvis Presley on the radio. She knew when they told her 2 bodies had been found before anyone confirmed who they were. And she knew for 33 more years that the man who had done this was still out there, that his voice was real, that his laughter was real, that he knew things about her daughter's feet that no one else in the world could have known. She went to her grave with that knowledge, and the case remains open. If you've made it this far, I'm curious. Do you think the girls died that first night, or do you believe the sightings, that they were alive for days or weeks before the end? And who do you think was responsible? Melquist, the convicted child killer who was never questioned, the local boys in the Black Mercury, or someone whose name was never written down in any police report? Let me know in the comments, but first have a good rest. I'll see you next time.